Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you part 2 of my review of the Tamron 35mm F2.8 OSD M1-2. And so this is a lens that is designed for Sony full-frame mirrorless. And if you want more information about the design, the specifications, and the autofocus performance, I recommend that you watch part 1 of this review, which you can check out here. And it gives you the nitty-gritty on all of those things and helps to detail the performance of the lens when it comes to how it takes the photos. And today we're going to take a closer look at the photos themselves and determine how it does when it comes to image quality. Now, of course, this lens at $349 is, within the range of what you would call a bargain-priced lens. But as we're going to see as we jump into its photo performance, it's not a bargain lens when it comes to its performance. And in many ways, I believe it punches above its weight optically. So let's jump in and let's take a closer look as to why that is and explore its performance in a variety of different metrics. So let's start by taking a look at the distortion and vignette that are here. And so you can see there is a mild amount of barrel distortion. There's a little bit more of the vignette, and we'll explore that a little bit further here. So in this case, on the right side, you see what I have done in a manual correction. There isn't yet a profile that's available. And so what you can see is it's a mild amount to begin with. It corrects fairly cleanly. There is a slightest wave pattern in there, but it's not enough to really be significant. As far as the vignette goes, I only had to plug in a +42 to brighten it up, but I had to pull the slider from the midpoint all the way to the left to 0. And so you have a vignette that reaches pretty far into the frame. Now, just to give you an idea of how that cleans up in the JPEG in camera, you can see that it has corrected both the vignette and the distortion without any kind of problem. And so both your video and then also your JPEGs are going to be nicely cleaned up in camera. So as a point of comparison now, I'm going to compare the 35mm prime lens with the 28-75 set at 35mm. So a few quick general observations. Color temperature is set the exact same here, and so you see that the prime is rendering a little bit cooler in this situation. You can see that there is maybe a hair more distortion on the zoom lens than what there is on the prime, but a little bit less vignette that is naturally there, I believe. The other thing I want you to note is that the prime set at 35mm is framing more widely than the zoom does at 35mm. So there seems to be about 1 or 2 millimeters difference in width there. Anyway, make of that what you will. In the center of the frame, as far as our resolution goes, we can see that both of them are actually really good. Good contrast, good resolution. Ever so slightly, you'll see that they metered differently, so I actually added a third stop extra back into the prime because it exposed 1/3 stop faster. And what we find is that the prime delivers a little bit brighter image in the center of the frame. Both of them have very strong resolution and contrast. If we move off towards the edge of the frame, the prime is a little bit better on this side. On this other side, the difference is a little bit more obvious. And you can see that it's definitely softer on the zoom lens than what it is on the prime. So we have a really even sharpness profile. Now, at different focus distances, this really bears out. And so here we are obviously composing right off towards the side of the frame, but you can see that the detail and the contrast are really excellent here. I mean, there's nothing to complain about there. That's tons of resolution on that. Likewise here, this shot impressed me because of the nice three-dimensional character of what we see here. And so you can see very good resolution on the subject, very good, very high contrast. No, all the edges are really nicely defined, no bleeding. The bokeh looks pretty decent here, very nice. And so, a nice cutout kind of look. Likewise here, this is actually shot on the A9, so not as high of resolution, but what you can see is that, really good detail, even though we're shooting into a backlit situation. You can also see that the bokeh in this particular image looks quite nice, and chromatic aberrations are well controlled in a situation that is, there's a lot of potential for seeing longitudinal CA. What we only see is maybe just a little bit of green fringing in some of these bokeh circles, but nothing significant at all. So a really strong performance there. One final real-world example at f2.8, we can see here that not only was focus nailed, but look at how nicely This is kind of in the micro contrast of the lens. You can see that it's really defining all these fine details here really exceptionally well. There's actually very little difference between f2.8 and f4. Right about mid-frame, like here and here, there's a very, very slight improvement. Not enough for you to hardly see or be worth doing here. I don't think that it would even show up on video. It barely does at the high resolution of my 4K monitor. What you can see at f5.6 is that we have had a little bit of a bump in our contrast and a bit in resolution. Here in the center of the frame, which looks fantastic. Looking off into the corner, we see that the corner is sharper also. The only other thing we can see is that vignette has really not lifted all that much. So if we can compare center of the frame between the prime and the zoom lens, we can see that the center of the frame, they look quite similar, not a huge amount of difference. Off in the corner, they're now more similar than different. I think the prime has the edge in this lower corner. We look up here at the top, they look more similar than different. I think right at the very edge, there's still a little bit of extra bit there for the prime lens. So how do landscape aperture images look? Well, as you can see, really, really crisp. Lots of detail here. I mean, you're not lacking for resolution with this lens. It has the ability to resolve lots of details across the frame. Holds up really nicely. And also, as you can see, color rendition is really quite good. Here's another shot across a frozen lake here, and so we can see that, wherever you kind of look in the frame, there's lots of detail right across the frame. And so optically, this is not a budget lens. It performs very strongly. So as we noted before, longitudinal chromatic aberrations are very strongly controlled. We can see just, this is a situation where there's tons of potential for it. Lots of light coming through ice crystals here. And so we can see tiny bit of purple fringing, tiny bit of green fringing, nothing really to complain about at all, though this is a fantastic performance. And look again how crisp the details are even at f2.8 and even at a very close focus distance. Now here's an interesting thing about the magnification. So on the left side, both of these shots, it's the A7R Mark III. So on the left side of the frame, I shot it in full frame mode, right side after I click crop mode. And so you can see that if you are actually using this on a crop camera, you're going to get more of this effect in that it's going to have more apparent magnification than what it does on the full frame. Now in this case, because all that APS-C mode is doing on the A7R III is cropping into the full frame image. So there's not any additional potential for resolution here. And so, the crop, or if we zoom into a pixel level, there's no difference in magnification between the two. However, if you were shooting on an APS-C camera, you would have the kind of magnification you see on the right, but you would be putting more pixels on it, 24 megapixels rather than 18. And so certainly you would have a little bit of advantage there. Either way, this is very useful for macro purposes when shooting on APS-C. It'll give you at least, on the full frame look of the image, it will appear like depth of field is more shallow and, some of those extra benefits that come in using it that way. Now, while I didn't have great conditions for shooting astro, I got a good performance out of the lens. You can see that star points, this is on the A7R III, are very nice and crisp, they're nicely formed there. As we move off towards the corner of the frame, you can see that there is just very, very tiny evidence of coma in the extreme corners, but it's not pronounced, a little bit of stretching there mid-frame. Overall, I would consider this to be a strong performance. The coma is definitely not going to be visible on a pixel level and quite well controlled. Definitely much, much better than what we saw with the Sony FE 35mm F1.8. Now, in many situations, the bokeh is fairly nice from this lens. You can see in this close-up image, you've got quite a nice fall off, and so nothing is really distracting. As we saw in our first episode, there is some geometric deformation, kind of cat eye effect along the edge of the frame. Unfortunately, that's pretty typical, but you can see that close-up performance and bokeh is quite nice here. Likewise in this image, which is actually a little bit smoother looking than what I saw under similar conditions with the Sony lens. So you can see great, really crisp detail there, really fantastic, good three-dimensional effect, and the bokeh is fairly soft here. One final image here to look at the bokeh quality. And so you've got a lot of sun in the frame here, so that'll help us to transition into flare resistance. But you can see here that the bokeh quality looks fairly nice. Some of these kind of prismatic type effects I'm not personally a fan of. Some people like them. I don't particularly, but that's the only real knock that I can give, other than, you know, the cat eye effect. In terms of the bokeh, I think that it's definitely not, it looks much better than what a lot of budget lenses do. Let's just leave it at that. Now, flare resistance, as we saw from the last image, is actually quite good. Wide open, it's pretty near flawless. Like we can see, there's no loss of contrast. The sun, as you can see a little bit more from the stop-down image, is right here. So we can see a tiny little ghosting artifact, but contrast across the scene is excellent. Stop down, we've got a little bit more of a faux pas here. You can see there's a little bit more of a ghosting blob that is there. However, it didn't really show up a lot for me in my real world images, and so I think that flare resistance, the B-bar coatings, are doing a good job. Here's a good result here, shows that with, you know, a very strong sun backlit here, contrast has held up really nicely, and we've got a good result there. Now in this case, obviously the image is held up shooting into bright light just fine. We can see a little bit of a ghosting artifact almost right out of the frame. Finally, we'll see here that you can also see when stopped down that this gives you a look at your sunburst effect. And you know, it's fairly nice. I prefer the blades to come out to a little more of a thin point, but it certainly is more of an asset than a liability. And this is the result from an uneven 7-bladed aperture here. So as you can see, a lot of encouraging things there. Good resolution, wide open across the frame. Real world resolution looks great. Real world contrast looks good. A control of chromatic aberrations and chromatic aberrations for the night sky are also good. Flare resistance is good. Really a lot of good things going on here. The only really negative that I can point to is some persistent vignette that is there, and you know, that doesn't clear up very well of its own accord. Fortunately, we do see, however, that the in-camera profiles for either JPEGs or video do a good job of correcting, and so byproduct of that is that you're not going to see it in those files. However, right now you will see it in post because there isn't yet a standard profile that is there, at least in Adobe products, for the lens. Now beyond that, however, we looked at the fact of the video performance when it comes to the autofocus in our last episode. But of course, this is going to be a tempting lens for using for video, for the simple reason, of course, it's a great focal length at 35 millimeters, and then you can throw it into the Super 35 crop and get something like a 52.5 millimeter, so right there in the standard range. And so also obviously a great focal length, very useful focal length. But as we just saw, it has a lot of great optical properties. Well, the upside of that, of course, is those optical properties remain when shooting video. And so video footage looks really good from the lens. It's very, very detailed, has good color, good contrast, all of those same qualities that we saw, as you can see from some of these clips here. And of course, I find out in getting real world footage that I tend to actually observe the autofocus quirks that we detailed last time less, because you obviously with some ambient noise you don't really hear the clicking all that much. For video work you don't necessarily need fast focus, you need smooth focus, and so for a lot of those things it works just fine. Just again, as I noted in the first episode, I wasn't thrilled in where I had a somewhat static subject that was moving just a little bit, in that I could constantly hear tiny little adjustments being made. And so the fact that the focus is not silent, it kind of draws your attention to that, and so it makes it actually seem less smooth than what it really is. And so anyway, so it's not what I would consider a top pick for video because of the focus related issues. But one asset that it does have is that I find sometimes with video, I tend to get too close to a subject, and I'll actually move because you're not being as intentional necessarily about focus. If you're using onboard focus, you're not necessarily as aware of where minimum focus limitations are always with a lens. And so a lens that can focus down very closely basically kind of removes that out of the equation, so you're not going to spoil footage by having moved a little too close to a subject to where the lens can't focus on it. And so it's either pulsing trying to find focus, or it's just focused on the wrong thing. And so I do think it would be a useful lens when it comes to that. The behavior of the manual focus ring itself is nothing to write home about. It's not really all that fantastic. It's not a Loxia lens for sure. And so You know, and I always say when it comes to these mirrorless lenses that in most cases, if you want to do manual focus, you need to buy a manual focus lens because that's not always their strength, and that's certainly the case here. At the end of the day, however, for $349, you've got a lot of optical performance for that. Now, of course, the competition, I've recently looked at the Sony FE 35mm F1.8. It obviously has a maximum aperture advantage. It has definitely better quality autofocus. And when it comes to the actual image quality, you know, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two, to be honest. Not enough for you to observe in a real world situation. And so I wouldn't necessarily make my choice based on that. Aperture value maybe, or if you prefer the macro capabilities of this lens, or if you prefer the price tag, which is half that of the Sony. That's certainly something worth considering. There are smaller lenses, both from Sony and from Samyang. And so, you know, if you want something really, really small, there are even smaller options than this. However, you won't get those, you know, macro type capabilities as a part of that. So, I mean, there's different reasons to consider that. How about the Tamron 28 to 75mm F2.8 RXD zoom that I'm testing on right now? As we saw optically, the two lenses are more similar than different when it comes to the optical performance, with maybe an edge in the corners going to the prime lens wide open and stop down to landscape apertures. They're about the same. Of course, again, advantage could be price and size. This lens is half the length basically of the zoom lens, and it weighs about 2.5 times less. And so, you know, that could be a consideration. It costs less than half as much. And so if you're on a tight budget and you mostly need 35mm, that's a good reason to consider the prime instead. All told, really there's a lot going on for this lens. It's not necessarily going to be everyone's favorite lens because of some of the autofocus noise and you know, I don't want to use the word slow because that's not accurate, but it can be slow. It's slower than some competitors. We'll leave it at that. But outside of that, this really is an overachiever optically, and so it's worth your consideration. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I do have linkage to my full text review. If you want to explore this a little more leisurely and look at some of the comparisons, you're welcome to do that there. There's also linkage to an image gallery if you'd like to look at photos and see if you like what you see. There's also buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. There's links to follow me on social media or to become a patron. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.